Russian on the top left, Polish on the top right, and then on the bottom you can see Yiddish was actually a national language. Unter Karbovances. This, however, was largely theoretical, involving several hundred intellectuals in Kyiv in particular, and it did not penetrate to the broader society as a whole, which were much more concerned with much more serious existential issues that unfortunately were expressed in horrible periods of violence. But nevertheless, this, like the Lutz Memorial, indicates that there's always been at least the potential for a Ukrainian Jewish rapprochement, a coming together, even though that has not always been the case in their long centuries of history together. You see things like, for example, this is in the modern state of Ukraine. The stamp is from 2011. The text reads 70 years after the tragedy of Babin Yar, which is, of course, one of the greatest massacres of the Einsatzgruppen. About 33,000 Jews were killed in the space of a few days in the city of Kyiv. It was also used, by the way, for several months afterwards for killing another 60,000 people, most of whom were not Jewish. It is probably the world's largest graveyard. And so it is encouraging to see that the Ukrainians are, to some degree, commemorating that, although it's a commemoration of both Ukrainian and Jewish deaths. And at the same time, you see, and here's your Stepan Bandera, they're also at the same time celebrating one of the most pro-Nazi Ukrainians from the period, who actively fought to try and bring the Nazis into Ukraine during World War II, and has been associated with all kinds of anti-Semitic activity. So how do we figure out Ukraine? On the one hand, we have, you know, this very kind of like liberal ideal of multiculturalism, and Jews are part of Ukraine and so on, and at the same time we also have these very xenophobic periods in which there were massacres of Jews at the hands of Ukrainians. It's a very, very difficult problem. At this point, I'm going to take you back in time, and we're going to try and walk through many centuries until we come back to the 20th century, and then hopefully we'll conclude with a discussion of the war in Ukraine. Okay, am I speaking appropriately in English? Okay, there.
You can go faster. Another way we can ask
questions. Okay, so here's a map of Ukraine. Where did the Jews come from in Ukraine? We have some legendary testimonials. It's hard to rely on them. They're kind of like lost in the mist of history, suggesting that Jews originally came to Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territory in the Crimean Peninsula. That's where that blue arrow points right now. There were suggestions that Jews were there, and it would be very typical of Jews at this time to be joining with Greek trading outposts, and especially as Roman legions began to expand throughout the entire area, we definitely have, you know, little isolated pockets of Jews. We don't have any really hard evidence, however, of Jewish presence until the Khazar Empire, which is a bizarre footnote in Jewish history that, because of its connection to Ukraine, I'm just going to take 3 minutes to discuss it. The Khazars, as you can see from the round circle here, they had a capital city called Itil on the Caspian Sea, right about over here. And in a rather remarkable, amazing moment, in roughly the year 730, the Khazars apparently converted to Judaism. Someone told them about gefilte fish, and they said, we have to have it. Who knows? And there's a lot of debate over what exactly happened. Did we hear that right? There's a lot that we could spend easily a whole hour just talking about this moment, but it is debated among historians just how deeply this conversion affected Khazarian society, if at all. But there's no doubt that there is evidence of Jews in this region who are called in non-Jewish sources, in Arabic sources, in early Slavic sources, as Khazarian Jews. So there are people in the 8th, 9th century, including in the very basic first major chronicle of Russian history, called the Povest Vremenia, which was a church document that essentially talks about these early centuries and mentions Khazarian Jews as being in dialogue with the first Christian prince of Kyiv, Volodymyr. So there definitely are Jews there, we just don't know a lot about them. Much more realistic, however, is the idea that most of the Jews who ended up there were not of Khazarian origin, because the Khazars, when their empire fell, they simply disappeared. They simply merged into general society without any real impact on the later populations. But at this time, Jews in the 13th to the 17th century were largely coming from Germany. That's why the Jews of Ukraine are overwhelmingly Ashkenazi as opposed to Khazarian. I will mention at this point, if you follow contemporary news and especially contemporary anti-Semitism, the so-called Khazarian hypothesis is very popular today, including there's a rather vitriolic strain of it that we spoke about briefly in my colleague Professor Carroll's talk of African Americans arguing that the Jews today who are lighter skinned, basically everybody in this room for the most part, are actually not the real Jews who come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're actually Khazars who, in some weird way, kind of supplanted the real Jews who are actually Africans. It's a bizarre theory. It has no merit whatsoever, but there's more to say about the reasons why someone like Kanye West would want to promote that theory than there is about the theory itself. But while we're at it, I will indicate that the overwhelming evidence is that the Jews of Ukraine are of Ashkenazi orientation. All of the linguistic evidence points to it. The historical records, of which there are many, documents the migration patterns. And we even have a significant amount of DNA evidence that proves that the Jews who come from Ukraine are in fact also from earlier generations in Eastern Europe, in the Rhineland. This map shows the tracing of DNA results of a representative survey of Ashkenazi Jews that shows the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews came from the Middle East and then made their way primarily up the Italian peninsula. And in the northern part of Italy, they've traced it actually to 4 women who were apparently converts to Judaism from northern Italy, who are responsible for almost half, 46% of Ashkenazi Jews today. I believe their names were Rivka, Rachel, Leah, and Sarah. They really constitute the basic. And there are also Jews who make their way from the Sephardic lands as well, and then from here, as I mentioned earlier, they make their way to Ashkenaz. But to show you some of the evidence of Khazarian Jewry, just very quickly, here is one of the most, we do have, by the way, some fascinating archaeological evidence that's very suggestive that there may have in fact been Jews in Khazaria at this time. For example, these mysterious objects that I discovered. I wasn't sure if this would work. I don't know if they have Chinese takeout here the same way. But seriously, we do have things like this remarkable document that was written in the 10th century and discovered in the Cairo Geniza. It's a remarkable document. I imagine you have the same thing here in Mexico, but it is a letter of introduction from Kiev, that is introducing to the community a Jew who has fallen on hard times and endorsing his request for financial support. In New York or in Israel, we call this a petek, like a document from the VAD that says, this person needs money, please help him, and you would bring it, it would laminate it. This one is not laminated, but you would bring it to the door and someone would give you money. Is that how they do it here in Mexico as well? Fascinating, at the very bottom, among the several people who endorse it, including several rabbinic figures, is this person who was obviously illiterate in Hebrew and had to write his name in Turkic runes. Again, suggesting something about the Khazarian conversion that may not have been as thorough as we expect. But nevertheless, let's set aside the entire Khazarian hypothesis. Let's talk about the Jews that constitute the bulk of the Ukrainian population, who primarily came to the region in the 13th through the 17th century. Why did they come to this region? 2 factors. In Western Europe, there was a dramatic increase in anti-Semitic pressure. The persecutions following the Black Death, the rise of the blood libel charge, host desecration charge, these were like really nasty things that were bearing hard on Western European Jews. And at the same time, the Poles who controlled Ukraine at this time were looking for people to develop the economy. And so the pressure pushing Jews out of Western Europe and the vacuum pulling Jews into Ukraine and Poland and Lithuania was huge, and it was adopted by hundreds of thousands of Jews over the centuries. And there, in Ukraine in particular, they served as a kind of a middleman in the economy, sometimes as arrendators, which means they were like leaseholders of large farms, and they would collect taxes from the farmers and then pass them on to the landowners. We'll return to that shortly. And they often fulfilled small roles in the economy that were extremely valuable, but no one else in a highly agrarian economy was prepared to do. Such as, for example, the classic Jewish innkeeper. This is a representation from 1928, sort of a nostalgia for 19th, 18th century models. But you have the Jewish innkeeper providing alcohol, which was typically given to the Jews. I will allow you to leave here. I locked the door because I am a professor and I have tenure, so I can get away with that. So Jews, by the way, the noblemen who owned the towns, literally owned the towns outright, everything, the streets, the people who were largely serfs, the bridges, the mills, everything, they would give the Jews exclusive right to prepare and sell alcohol. It was something called propinatia. And so Jews were typically associated with inns where they would like host people who were childers and so on, also associated with music. Klezmer was developed there and so on. These are like classic Ukrainian costumes here, and they're shown enjoying themselves in a very ethnically segregated society with Jews involved in these roles. However, there was definitely a dark side to this, because while the Jews found a niche in the economy, it was ultimately an exploitative economy, where the Polish landlords who owned these massive tracts of land would engage in something called tax farming, where they would say to the Jews, okay, you know, I don't have the headspace or the freedom to manage all of my villages. I think that this year you can collect 10,000 zloty from my villages. And the Jews would say, as a community, it was like you didn't have individuals, it was like the community would work as itself, much like in Mexico, you have very strong community organizations here. The Jews would say, all right, this time next year we will deliver 10,000 zloty. And the Jews would go out and they would be legally empowered to collect the zloty however they could. Taxes on produce, tolls on bridges, even in some cases, the keys to the church would be held by the Jews. And if you wanted to have a baptism or a wedding or something like that, you had to pay a tax to be allowed to use the church, which was like a great insult to Ukrainian peasants who felt that why should we have to pay the Jew, even though he's really paying the Polish nobleman, but why should we have to pay the Jew to use our own church? There was a certain amount of resentment there. It would be all well and good, except this system spun out of control, because if the Jews succeeded and provided their 10,000 zloty at the end of the year, then the nobleman would say, well, that was easy. I guess you can probably get 1,200 zloty or 1,500 zloty, whatever the number is. And the number would keep going up. And the Jews would have to go back and exact it from the Ukrainian peasants. And by the way, the Jews would always charge more, because the difference between what they had to pay the nobleman and what they collected was for themselves. That was what kept the community going. So this was an economy that could not be sustained. And without surprise, in the 17th century, there was a major peasant uprising led by someone named Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And this was kind of like a turning point in the Ukrainian national self-image, and also had to do with their view of the Jews. This guy, Khmelnytsky, led a band of or Cossacks in English, who were sort of like refugees from the economy, who had fled from their ancestral farms and were largely living on the margins of society, like on the rapids of the river Dnipro and so on. And they were, in the Ukrainian mind, sort of like the American cowboy in the Wild West. Freedom-loving, they would sometimes organize themselves and go out on raids, particularly of Turks who were kidnapping Christian children for the slave trade, and so this was seen as like they were heroic to the Ukrainians. In 1648, Khmelnytsky brought together a huge coalition of these Kozaké, and they rose up against the Polish landlords, against their Jewish leaseholders, and against other Ukrainians who had adopted Catholicism. And it was a massively successful revolt. They were very good at popular violence. Unfortunately, tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed in the violence, especially because the Polish noblemen were far away in Warsaw, but the Jews were right here in Ukraine, so they were the lightning rod for much of this aggression. And it was a huge upheaval in Eastern Europe, and it signaled the end, the dark side of the Arenda economy. Now, the Kozaké, I really want to underline, for Ukrainians, they view the Kozaké as, like unmitigated heroes. They're fantastic. They're freedom lovers. They want to liberate Ukrainians from all these national yokes, which for Jews, that also means that we're going to be attacked by them. Nevertheless, and this is something that Ukraine has to work through on its own, they're not quite there yet, Khmelnytsky, shown here, is a national hero. This is a Ukrainian 5 hryvnia note from the late 1990s, I believe, and he's depicted on it like a George Washington, and that's how they regard him. It's very common for Ukrainians to grow the long walrus mustache, to play the bandura, which is all representative of this kind of thing, but for Jews, it's a very frightening image. We see Khmelnytsky in a very different light. Kind of like, I would imagine, a lot of the indigenous people here look at Christopher Colon and say, well, maybe he's not our hero. They might look at him very differently. There are some... Well, we'll have to come to questions shortly. Now, this is one more example of it today. You may recall this stamp that was issued after when the Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Navy, was still afloat, and they wanted to take Snake Island, and the Ukrainians who were guarding Snake Island, responded with an expletive, with profanity, and so they made a stamp out of it, and you can see that gesture also works in Ukrainian as it does, I think, in Mexican as well. And that's very much the kind of Khmelnytsky mentality which the Ukrainians celebrate as really their national spirit. Of course, it is difficult for us as Jews to identify with that, but nevertheless, that is the situation. So that takes us sort of up through the 17th century. Let me emphasize now this aspect of the economic relationship, which is so important. Ukrainians and Jews were never on their own to figure out their mutual history and their mutual future. There was always a triangular relationship. There was always one other party, usually a colonial party like the Poles or the Russians, who were involved in this story, and that skews it in one direction or another. This happens to be an interesting monument. On the left, you see some young historian in the 1980s visiting it, and it's this ark that was erected by the Russian Soviets to celebrate the great freedom and unity of the Ukrainian and Russian peoples. This is because after the Khmelnytsky uprising of 1648-49, Khmelnytsky discovered that although he was great at motivating people to rise up and fight, he was terrible at actually running a country. And at a certain point he said, I can't do this anymore, we need to have someone else in charge. And so he appointed Russia and essentially joined with Russia, saying, we'll be part of your larger political enterprise, something which many Ukrainians felt was a betrayal of their cause. Their greatest poet, Taras Shevchenko, wrote one poem saying that he wished that Khmelnytsky's mother had rolled over in her sleep and smothered young Bogdan rather than have them unite with Russia. So it is kind of an ambiguity that we're going to explore in future. This great arc that symbolizes the connection between Kiev and Moscow is celebrated with these two heroic, muscular men, the Ukrainian on the left, the kind of buff Russian on the right, each holding up the Soviet emblem, saying now we have this great Druzhba Narodov, the friendship of peoples, and we really are one people together. Very important for the Russian mentality. In 2020, this was well before the war, Ukrainians put a crack in the monument as if to say, Russia, we're not so sure about this anymore. If I remember correctly, I believe this monument has been destroyed since as a consequence of the war. Because this idea of the great friendship between Ukraine and Russia was primarily an invention of Russia. It was something that Jews appreciated, though, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, when we're talking about language, Jews tended to orient themselves towards the most powerful nation, which in this case would be the Russian nationality, even though they lived in a largely Ukrainian setting. So this is like some of the complex part. I'm going to have to go through it quickly. If you don't get it, don't worry about it. The main idea is these triangular relationships. Ukraine was under Polish rule until Khmelnytsky in 1648. And at that time, the Jews were largely oriented to the Poles. The Jews thought the Poles would protect them, and if they learned a language other than Yiddish, it would be Polish. On the other hand, after Khmelnytsky, when Ukraine fell under Russian rule, Jews tended to orient themselves to Russia until the very late end of the 19th century, when it began to spoil. When the period of national awakening hit the Jews of Ukraine, when you begin to see Zionism, which was really, modern political Zionism was born in Ukraine with movements like Chovet Zion and Bilu. These are all happening on the coast in Odessa. They're beginning to say, hey, wait a minute, we should not be attaching ourselves to other peoples. We should be expressing our own national identity. These are all things happening in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians as well are beginning to say, you know, Khmelnytsky made a mistake. 300 years later, we see that, you know, the Russians are oppressing us, not allowing us to use our language, and so on and so forth. So that created the kind of Grundlage, the foundations for another major uprising. And that's what happens in the 20th century. These events are well known, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but really focus on Jews and Ukrainians. When the Russian Empire collapsed, as I began, there were a few intellectuals who said, hey, maybe Jews and Ukrainians, we can figure this out. We have a difficult, dark history, but we have been here for 1,000 years. We developed Hasidism here. We developed great Hebrew literature. Yiddish literature is born in Ukraine. Shalom Aleichem, Mendel Mocher Sporim. We should create a new rapprochement, but it was eventually submerged in popular violence, as you had wave after wave of pogroms, primarily perpetuated by Ukrainians against Jews that swept through the region. Some of the more complex characters include this man, Simon Petliura, who was a leader of the Ukrainian government during this period of violence. And there's all kinds of details that we could go into, but basically, in my personal assessment, which I wrote a book on, so I guess I know, more or less, he failed to take action against the pogromists because he feared he would lose control of them when he was trying to defend Ukraine from Russia. And so his act personally was one of omission. He did not stand up and say we should not be attacking the Jews until it was far too late, that the pogrom wave was already overwhelming the Jewish population. But like Khmelnytsky, he is revered as a hero by Ukrainians and a villain by Jews. This is especially the case. This is one statue that was created for him in Venezia in 2017 and the site of some protests. It's especially true because he was later assassinated in Paris by a Jew named Shalom Schwarzbart, shown here, who walked up to him as he was exiting a restaurant and said to him, "Vous êtes Monsieur Petliura?" And he said yes, and he pulled out a gun and he shot Petliura dead, saying, "This is for the pogroms, this is for my murdered family," and so on. After a remarkable trial that was covered the world over, including in the New York Times, the assassin, Schwarzbart, was acquitted of the crime because in the French judicial system, his motive of revenge was considered appropriate to the action that he took. It was a really remarkable, bizarre kind of decision, which seemed to be sort of balanced against the bizarre Dreyfus decision 30 years earlier, as if the jury wanted to kind of balance the scales, but at any rate, Schwarzbart went free. For Ukrainians, this was viewed as a terrible miscarriage of justice. For Jews, it was viewed as a validation of the Jewish perspective on their history. Here is a remarkable piece by Chagall that was created at the time, which shows an upraised Torah scroll with the name Schwarzbart written on it, as if Schwarzbart himself is the Torah, with the angel of death or the angel of vengeance flying overhead. This is the kind of mood of the Jewish people with regards to Ukrainians before World War II. And here's one more example of this in Beersheba, Israel. There is a street named after Shalom Schwarzbard that's called Rehov Hanokeh, the street of the Avenger. Right? And it's viewed in a very positive sense in this particular connection.
His name is Shalom.
Shalom Schwarzbard. Yeah, I know. Samuel. It's ironic, but there you go. Now, the darkest part of this story, of course, is the Holocaust. And it's regretful that we don't have more time to spend really exploring it. But that's when all of these contradictory trends come together and are exacerbated by the incredible violence that occurred. If you look at this map here, the country of Poland, which existed briefly between World War I and World War II, was divided along this line here by the Soviets and the Germans. The Germans took this region. The Soviets took this region here. And Ukraine is primarily to the south of all of this. This would be Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territory. This is also known as the Bloodlands among historians. That's a term used by my colleague Timothy Snyder. This area here is where the synagogue of Lutsk was located, actually a little bit further north, but this is the region where much of the worst violence occurred. The violence was especially pronounced after July 22nd, June 22nd, 1941, when the Germans betrayed the Soviets and broke their deal and invaded the Soviet Union. Stalin was caught completely off guard and was immediately swamped with the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe making their way over Russian territory. Hitler, because now it was open war on the Jews, sent behind the troops a series of 4 mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen, and they made their way through the entire region in the south in Ukraine, in Belarus and Poland, and to the north in Lithuania and Latvia, where most of my family were killed. And these mobile killing squads essentially went into the tiny villages that dotted the entire countryside. They rounded up Jews, any known communists who had stayed behind, intellectuals, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, anyone that didn't fit their kind of racial ideology, and they marched them out to the ravines and shot them dead. This is also called in English the Holocaust by bullets, because a very large number, historians estimate between 1.5 and even 2.5 million Jews were killed in this manner. Now, how this connects to Ukraine is especially important because, as you will recall, that region was taken over by the Soviets, and the Ukrainians resented this very, very deeply. I'm just going to skip past these images for now because I think our time is crushing us. So let's bring it up to the 20th century. The war today, of course, is waged by Vladimir Putin. Here's an early photograph of him when he was still in the KGB. He has this conception of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, which includes Ukraine as really the heartland, because the earliest expressions of Slavic political organization were not in Moscow. Moscow really doesn't become much of a city until after the Mongols recede, and we're talking about 14th century. It is in Kiev that the great Slavic centers of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus have their origins, and he really views Kiev, as most Russians do, as their Jerusalem, so to speak. And so it's very difficult for him to imagine this Russian world that does not have its foundational location within its boundaries. And early on in the war, he said, okay, we have to attack Ukraine, and he made up this bizarre reason that because the Ukrainians are Nazis. And this is the key point here. He was alluding to the fact that there were Ukrainians who actively supported the Nazis in their fight against the Soviets. And there were also Ukrainians, of course, who were involved in the murder process. And so using that historical trope, Putin hoped to rise up Russian aggression against Ukraine and to justify the war. It appears that initially he was successful, and one of the great black boxes, the unknowns, is what do Russians really think of this current war? It's they're hampered by these horrible propaganda laws. But this was kind of like calling on Russians to go back to this heroic moment. This is a rather dramatic statue that exists in Kiev right now that is a commemoration to World War II and has this massive structure of a woman with a sword and a shield with the Soviet emblem facing to the west, defending the motherland from the advancing Nazis. And so Putin was trying to buy into that ideology by saying the current independent Ukrainian government is dominated by Nazis. We must revive this great heroic struggle of World War II, the great patriotic war, and push them out. Now, he was very, very wrong, but on the other hand, he was also not entirely wrong. Just to give you one example, here's some propaganda from the late 1940s, and it celebrates two organizations, the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and UPA, which is a Ukrainian insurgent group. And you may see, if you can read Slavic at all, it says in the top here, Slava Ukraini, which is, the thing that modern Ukrainians today, Zelensky typically ends all of his speeches with Slava Ukraini, which means glory to Ukraine. And the response at the end is Heroyam Slava, glory to the heroes. This was essentially a pro-Nazi slogan, which is one of the reasons why, even though I personally support the Ukrainians very much in their struggle against the Soviets, I can't bring myself to say Slava Ukraini and Heroyam Slava because it was originally a slogan that was created by pro-Nazi Ukrainians. Here you can see, though, illustrative of the way they think of themselves, the Ukrainian soldier here, who seems to be raising his hand in a Nazi salute. He's standing on both a Soviet flag and a Nazi flag at the same time, meaning we want to achieve independence, and if it requires us to make an alliance with the Nazis to drive out the Soviets, we will do so. That's the argument they took, of course, which was disastrous for Jews. And we see this phenomenon even in the contemporary war. This is from April of 2022. One of the more controversial elements in the Ukrainian army was a unit called the Azov Battalion, most specifically associated with the siege of Mariupol, who openly had fascistic elements in them. Now, it was a minority of the Ukrainian armed forces, and it was, really a subject of a big propaganda push from the Russians to try and, create an image that all the Ukrainians were fascists. But nevertheless, it existed. And in this particular image from the Jerusalem Post, they were complaining that, wait a second, the neo-fascistic Azov Battalion are using weapons designed by Israelis. That was considered, very jarring to the Jewish mind. So to try and bring this together, under people like Putin, he's pointing out correctly that there is a right-wing tendency in Ukrainian society that views the territory as one that should be Ukraine for Ukrainians, and that's very frightening to Jews. But it only makes sense within this kind of Russian worldview of the Ruski Mir that is being eroded by these fascistic tendencies. On the other hand, we have Volodymyr Zelensky, who represents that other trend that we have occasionally seen poking its head above the waters in history of a Eurocentric Ukraine. Meaning that rather than participate in this Russian narrative, we really should be, says these Ukrainians, part of the larger European narrative. And just as Europe, if you exclude, let's say, Hungary, for example, or maybe recently Italy, Europe has always moved towards more liberal democracies, more multicultural democracies, more countries based on rights and freedoms. Many Ukrainians are saying we should definitely move ourselves in that direction. And the fact that the Ukrainians could elect a Jewish president, they also had a Jewish premier for a while at the same time, is very indicative of this. That they seem to have removed themselves from a narrow ethno-nationalist kind of worldview and looking towards themselves as a kind of a European state. And I would argue that Putin's invasion, ironically, once he failed to actually take Kyiv early in the war, he basically lost at that point because the Ukrainians are cemented in this Eurotropism. They want to be part of NATO, they want to have a liberal democracy, and they're never going to go back to that Russian mindset. maybe not for generations upon generations. So let's bring it to the implication for the future. This is one chart that I think deserves a lot more attention. It's a study of anti-Semitic attitudes in Europe that was done by the very respectable Pew Research Center in 2019, well before the war. And they asked people in Europe, do you believe that Jews have the right to be part of your society? Do you believe that Jews should be citizens in your society? The results are surprising. Ukraine came up with the lowest number of people who said Jews should not be equal citizens in society. 5% of Ukrainians who answered this survey said they don't want Jews as neighbors, essentially, which is a pretty good result compared to America. If you look at other countries, 14% of Russians don't want Jews, 23% of Lithuanians don't want Jews, which I find really surprising because my family is Lithuanian. What's wrong with me? 23%, Romania, 22%. This survey actually supports the idea that Ukraine has really bought into the Eurotropic mission far more than any of its neighbors surrounding it, which is good news. This was 3 years before the war. And in fact, we see that when you compare it to the United States, it's actually a less anti-Semitic country than even the United States.
Amazing.
And especially compared to Muslims, which Americans really don't like, and atheists, which they don't like so much either. So what's going to happen from the war is hard to say. I think the end picture, this is an early map, this is when the Ukrainians had still lost Kherson. The end is clear. Ukraine will win this war. It's only a question of how long will it take for Putin to lose the war. It could be years, which would be horrible in terms of human violence, but it is inevitable because the Ukrainians are simply not turning back. And Jews as well have identified very strongly with the Ukrainians in this struggle, not only Jews in Ukraine, where they feel themselves very much part of the struggle, but Jews around the world have overwhelmingly adopted this minority trope in Ukrainian Jewish history of the Eurocentric mission. And that, I think, is grounds for some hope. As a historian, I often worry about the future, but I say, thank God I was educated in the history department. I will leave the prophecy department to specialists. But nevertheless, we hope that this war will end soon and bring peace to all the combatants, and hopefully the Jews will be able to see a Yeshua. Thank you very much for your time.